Joining us now is Howard Pawley, the former Premier of Manitoba, whose autobiography was just published called Keep True, A Life in Politics. And it's great to see you again.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Welcome
Likewise.
aboard. I want to start by just putting up some of the bullet point highlights of your background, so those of our viewers who don't know as much about you as they will by the time we're done talking will know. We call this the man from Manitoba, but in fact, you're not from Manitoba. You're born in Brampton, Ontario, November 21st of 34. How's this for babysitting? You were babysat by M.J. Coldwell, leader of the CCF from 42 to 60. You attended Brampton High at the same time as William Davis, two premiers out of that one high school. You ran in the 57 federal election and lost. You ran in the 58 Manitoba election and lost. You ran in the 65 federal election and lost. You ran in the 69 Manitoba election and finally won. And then, of course, became the 18th Premier of Manitoba from 81 to 88. And ironically, Mr. Davis was the 18th Premier of Ontario. You two have way too much in common. Well, people always ask, how did so-and-so get interested in politics in the first place? And for you, I gather it was a visit from your local MP, Gordon Graydon, who was also Bill Davis's political hero at the time, when you were I guess you were just a kid at the time. Tell us about that visit.
Well, my father was very much involved in politics. He ran for the CCF in Peel County in 1937. And I can remember still, to this day, the visit by Clary Gillis and Scotty Bryce. They were two CCF MPs, accompanied by Gordon Graydon. Gordon Graydon, I think, was hosting them for the weekend.
He was conservative, though.
And he was conservative, and he was having a problem figuring out just where there might be a CCF farmer in his constituency. And the only CCF farmer he could think of was my father. We farmed just 3 miles from Snowgrove.
But something clicked in that visit, right? Something about the work they did planted a seed?
That's right. It did very much, and it's very peculiar that I ended up representing Selkirk provincially.
In Manitoba.
Scotty Bryce was a federal member in Manitoba. And the two of them, I remember both of them so well.
You remember the first time you heard Tommy Douglas speak?
Yes, yes.
What impact did that have on you?
Oh, it had an amazing impact on me. It was at the old United College, currently the University of Winnipeg. And of course, the best speaker I'd ever heard. And I still remember one of my fellow conservative friends at the old United College come up to me and indicate that he wished he had not attended because now he had some doubts. Only Tommy Douglas could do that.
Gotcha. We pointed out in the opening here, you lost and lost and lost. And a lot of guys would simply say after 3 straight losses, okay, it's not meant to be. Why did you not simply give up?
Well, actually, my running was because during the summer months, as I went to university, I organized for the then CCF. So I ended up running as sacrificial candidate in both those provincial elections.
Like all those folks from Quebec in the last federal election.
Yes, but I wasn't lucky like that. I should have gone to Vegas, maybe. But then in 1965, I did run as a serious candidate, and hoped to win, but I didn't.
And in 69, you end up getting into a car accident and spending most of the election in hospital, and that's the one you won.
Yes, it is, and I never expected to win that one.
How did that make any sense?
Ed Schreier visited me in the hospital,
he was
and he indicated to me, he was the leader of the NDP, my wife's first cousin, by the way. Mm-hmm. And as he's preparing to leave after visiting me, he says, "Howard, you can do me a favor. Would you let your name appear on the ballot?" I said, "Well, Ed, I won't be able to do much campaigning." "Howard, it's not going to make that much difference here anyway. We've never managed to save our deposit. I just need a name on the ballot." I reluctantly agreed because I had a law office at that time and it was doing quite well. So I was just completely stunned election night to have won. I thought it was just another sacrificial run for me.
That picture in the paper of you getting out of the hospital with your family greeting you there, you think that had some significance? I mean, it painted a nice picture of a nice family man.
It did, and to tell you the truth, it was 4 or 5 years ago I had a call from a gentleman who was a Baptist minister in Selkirk at the time, I thought was a staunch conservative. Said, "Something's been bothering me all these years, Howard. You know that picture that appeared in the paper? just before your election. I gave you a boost. We all, Mac McFarland, the editor of the paper, and I got together. We had coffee one afternoon, and we decided together that we'd do you a favor. We liked you. We didn't like your opponents.
That's how it works, eh?
Yes.
That's funny. Well, you got a point. You won the election, of course. The Schreier government was formed. You got into cabinet right away, and you were tasked with implementing public auto insurance for the province of Manitoba. Take us back. How bruising a battle was that?
It was the second most fierce battle in the province's history, second to the 1919 strike. Thousands marched on the legislature in opposition. My life was threatened on several occasions. In fact, it was rather strange. On one of the occasions, I was making my way out of the city, being escorted by police cars. Got to the city limits. The Winnipeg police cars turned around and went back. Then I continued the rest of my way to my home in Selkirk. To me, that meant something about the blindness of jurisdiction. And
so you're on your own outside of Winnipeg.
Yeah, that is correct.
Did you worry about your kids?
Yes, I did. And they were only 6 and 4 at that point. And that particular issue became my signature issue. In years that followed, it would be a positive. It would, at one point, be a negative issue insofar as I was concerned, because I was always associated with that particular issue, public auto insurance.
What happened when insurance executives would come to you and they would say, you know, if you go forward with this, we are absolutely going to bury you. We're going to crush your government. We're going to make your life hell. How do you react to that?
Oh, that made me more fierce. And then I'd go to cabinet and report to them what these executives had said. And they would then become as well more determined that we were going to go ahead with this. Interestingly, at the time, we were one short of a majority. And we had finally had to depend upon a Liberal, turned New Democrat, and independent to vote for us, or our bill would have failed in the legislature. You don't see too many governments today in such narrow circumstances be prepared to take on such a ferocious issue. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you, Steve, it was the most popular issue we brought in at the time.
Well, you got reelected, didn't you?
And it gave us re-election. Otherwise, we may not have been reelected, but public auto insurance was very popular at that time.
I want to read a quote from the book. We're headlining this, No Retreat. Quote, "The battle demonstrates that sometimes the biggest struggles, including those with the most conflict, can in the long term be the most lasting and rewarding politically. Too often, governments, including social democratic ones, retreat rather than fulfilling their commitments to the public." Now, when I read that, I could not help but think, I don't know if you meant this, but I couldn't help think about, you know, the Bob Rae government in the province of Ontario promising to bring in public auto insurance after winning that 1990 election. And then on the first anniversary of that election, they stood down. They decided that the economic times were too tough and they couldn't do it. Take us back 20 years. What did you think when the Rae government stood down from that promise?
Candidly, I was very disappointed. I think indeed if they had brought in public auto insurance and implemented it and had been as successful as we were in implementing it, they would have secured a second term. And I think a party such as a New Democratic Party must be prepared to distinguish itself from the other two parties. And there must be issues that clearly define it. In our particular case, it was a public auto insurance. It's not just because motorists received lower premiums. The cost was about 1/2 administratively what it would have been under a private plan. But it also meant that money would remain in the province of Manitoba rather than ending up in Toronto, please forgive me, or in New York or somewhere else. All the money stayed within the province of Manitoba.
Now, you were no longer the Premier when Bob Rae was Premier of Ontario. You weren't Premier of Manitoba anymore, but did you call him at that time?
Yes, I did.
And did you tell him you thought he...
Yes, and he said to me, "Howard, you don't seem to understand. This is Ontario, 1991, not Manitoba, 1971.
Well, he was right about that. Did you not think that made a difference?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
And interestingly, he acknowledges in his book, at that point, all the previous NDP premiers had written to him, urging him to go ahead with it, whether it was Blakeney, Dave Barrett, myself. He mentions that in his book.
He was worried about thousands of mostly female people in the insurance industry who would have been on the unemployment lines in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression. That's why he stood down.
They would, but in a Crown corporation, such as Public Auto Insurance, you have to hire. So there'd been an opportunity to have hired many of them into the Ontario
20 years later, you haven't changed your mind on this,
No, I haven't.
Okay,
I'm stubborn.
Good enough. 1977, NDP government of Manitoba is defeated. Premier Ed Schreier, much to everyone's surprise, gets appointed Governor General by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and you decide to run for the leadership of the party. How come?
Well, I was kind of reluctant at the time because it hadn't been my intention to become so. But there had been considerable division within the party. And I was seen as the one that could reconcile the differences. So I was persuaded by a majority within the caucus to seek the interim leadership, then the leadership at the provincial convention.
I'm going to say some things here that are not too complimentary, but you say them in the book, so, if you put them there, I think I'm okay in doing this.
Yes.
You've often been described as a decent guy, a nice guy, an honorable guy, but not particularly ruthless and not particularly ambitious, both of which are qualities that I think conventional wisdom says you got to have in order to be a successful leader in politics. Were you concerned you weren't tough enough for the job?
Yes, of course, I was somewhat concerned about that because I do believe in delegating, but also I expect those that I delegate to report back to me. Although I was concerned about that, we secured a record. In 1981, we won. And we won defeating the only one-term government in Manitoba's history, that of Sterling Lyon. So despite all those expressions of concern, Pawley's not enough like Sterling Lyon, it demonstrated that sometimes it's important you have somebody the opposite of the incumbent.
It's been said that Howard's idea of a good time is going down to Eaton's on a Friday night to try on gloves. Is that true?
The reality is, Steve, I hate shopping. I hate going to malls. My wife would tell you that.
You were, I think, when you were Premier of Manitoba, the only NDP government in the country, right?
Yes, we were, except for maybe 3 or 4 months when Premier Blakeney, when we were first elected, was Premier of Saskatchewan.
What is that like when you go to all premiers meetings and you're the only NDPer in the room?
You can feel pretty lonely because during a good chunk of my time, after Trudeau and Turner, we had about 3-4 years of Mulroney. So I was surrounded by conservative premiers. Plus, well, I shouldn't say surrounded. There were 2 or 3 liberals by the tail end too. It was Peterson and Bourassa and Giz. But yeah, I was the only one. So it was an uphill battle.
I think David Peterson knew the feeling. He was the only Liberal premier in the country when he first got elected in 85.
That's correct. And then Premier Giz was elected in Prince Edward Island.
Let's talk about one of, and now anybody who remembers living through this time will remember this battle, the French-English battles in the province of Manitoba. And for those who don't know, we should do a bit of a history here. Manitoba, of course, has a significant Francophone population, and you, as Premier, had to kind of balance the French language rights that the Francophones there felt they had, and which constitutionally they did have, against, I guess, Anglophones who didn't want to see French rammed down their throats too much. How'd you deal with that?
Oh, this was the most difficult issue we had to deal with. And unfortunately, Steve, was the most unpopular issue we were involved in. And the reason that we had to proceed with it, besides social justice, beside historic rightness, was legal. In 1870, Manitoba was a bilingual province. In 1890, a provincial law was passed making English only the language. Then we had a speeding ticket offense. Mr. Bilodeau. And Mr. Bilodeau refused to pay the speeding ticket on the basis that the Highway Traffic Act was in English only. Our legal advisor said all your laws could be neutralized, could become void in the province. You better work out a solution. And we sat down with the Society Franco-Manitoban, Mr. Bilodeau and other parties, And we worked it out where rather than 5,500 statutes being translated since 1890, only 550 would have to be. We thought Manitobans would applaud, but instead there was so much anger. There was an intensity beyond anything I had seen before. And I was so saddened by this. Then we got in legislature, Sterling Lyon, Gary Filmon, both opposed us as leaders of the Conservative Party. There were 13 days of bell ringing. Finally, we had to prorogue the House. And the matter went to the Supreme Court. And we ended up having to translate all 5,500 statutes, not 550 as we had worked out. So we spent a lot of money we should have been able to avoid if it wasn't for that anger and the opposition that occurred to that. Our figures in the polling slumped down to less than 20% during the intensity of that debate.
This got nasty, right? I mean, on the floor of the legislature, people were sending bigoted slurs across the floor at each other, right?
Oh, yes. It was very, very... In fact, it was another instance where there were death threats, not just against me, but several other individuals at the same time. And people kept referring to us as being duds of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Interestingly, the person that had an advantage from this was Brian Mulroney, who opposed his own party in Manitoba.
Right.
And Quebec looked positively upon Brian Mulroney for having the courage to do that.
You made him a star.
And all-party resolution was passed in the House of Commons supporting us, but it didn't make any difference in Manitoba. The people felt we were just being manipulated by federal leaders in Ottawa.
Since you brought up Brian Mulroney, I want to ask you a few questions about him, because while the French language issue helped make him a star nationally, because he was standing up for French language rights, and the next time he went to the polls, he won 58 seats in Quebec, thanks in part to his sticking up for French language rights in Manitoba. Something else in Manitoba helped torpedo his career as well, which was the CF-18 fighter jet maintenance contract. Just again, to remind people of the history, the Mulroney government eventually picked what many people thought was an inferior bid from a Quebec company. They did not go with what many people thought was the superior bid from Bristol in Manitoba. How did you find out about that decision?
Well, that's a very trying thing for me, because rumors reached me that indeed Brian Mulroney and the Conservatives in Ottawa were flip-flopping on that commitment they made about the best quality, lowest price. And I called Brian Mulroney and talked to him. He said, "Oh, Howard, my friend, haven't I always been a good friend of Western Canada, the banks in Alberta, the farmers in Saskatchewan?" He says, "No decision's been arrived at about this. I haven't looked at the file. I'll call you before I make a decision."
Did you believe him when he said that?
Yes, I did. I thought Brian Mulroney wouldn't mislead me on this. But information came out since, showing quite clearly that the award was given to Quebec, and a decision had been made about this before his conversation with me. I was ferocious. And at the press conference following his announcement, I said, "You can't trust this man." Now, maybe it was untoward of me to make that kind of statement. Brian Mulroney was very angry with me because of it. But what this issue did, Steve, was trigger the birth of the Western Reform Party, led by Preston Manning. The anger wasn't just in Manitoba. It spread across into the prairie provinces and British Columbia.
Well, I guess it was a sign that whenever push comes to shove, Quebec is always going to win over Western interests.
Yeah, at that time, certainly that was the case.
The reality, however, goes a little deeper than that, because, of course, Ed Broadbent was the federal NDP leader at the time, and he was, if I can put it this way, sucking up to Quebec as well in order to get votes there. So he wasn't beating the drum to help you too much either, was he?
No, unfortunately, Ed talked about the need for a commission to look into this rather than coming clearly down on side of Manitoba. That disappointed Manitobans because we were the only NDP province in the country. And I understand why Ed Broadbent was doing that. At the time, like today, the polling for the NDP was quite high in the province of Quebec. There was opportunity for breakthrough in Quebec. So that Ed, unfortunately, was placed into an awkward situation, squeezed between two pressures at the same time.
I want to ask you about another incident you had with Brian Mulroney, and that was around the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord. He came up to you at one point. I guess you were either on the fence or perhaps a little bit opposed to it at the time. And on the fence is something I shouldn't have said. Politicians hate being told they're on the fence. Let's say you weren't on side with him yet at this point. And he said, okay, go ahead, oppose it if you want, and you'll be responsible for breaking up the country. What'd you say to him when he said that to you?
Oh, I don't know exactly what I said, but I was deeply worried. Deeply worried because I was concerned about the weakening of the spending power provision. And I didn't like the process. 16 hours behind closed doors. Directly opposite to 3 years plus that we had spent trying to resolve the Aboriginal self-government issue. I was ashamed that the 11 of us behind closed doors would arrive at this. And it was the most difficult situation I was in. I did obtain compromises vis-a-vis the spending power provision, and David Peterson got some compromises vis-a-vis distinct society that I was concerned about too. And it was clear to me that if I walked out, I'd be the only premier to walk out of the session.
So
this would not do Manitoba any good at that time.
Let's talk, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring up a bad memory here, your defeat. The NDP government's defeat in 1988. They say that one vote can't make a difference, but this was a case where one vote made all the difference in the world. Tell us the story about how one of your own backbenchers, a guy named Jim Wilding, refused to support your own budget and brought your own government down.
Jim Walding got increasingly bitter, beginning in the Schreier period, continuing on into my period, because he felt that we were not acting legitimately with him. We had not appointed him to cabinet. And he increasingly became embittered as a consequence of that. And unfortunately, in our case, he voted against my government at the worst possible time, after our re-election, but at a critical time for us. We had been compelled to increase auto insurance rates by about 20%. And because it was my signature issue, people would say, why did Howard Pawley allow that to happen? Why? Meech Lake was a negative at that time. So his timing was excellent. Unfortunately, it was just at the right time for us to be defeated.
In hindsight, should you have put him in cabinet?
I should have done something. Should have put him in cabinet. I should have made a deal with Sharon Carstairs, who was leader of the Liberals in the House at that time. I keep asking myself, could I have avoided this? Now, the reaction to that by some of my colleagues is, if you had put him into cabinet, you know that we would not have been in caucus, because there was bitterness between Jim Walding and quite a number in our caucus. So I was caught in quite a tight squeeze in connection with that.
He's dead now, right?
Yes, he is.
So you can say whatever you want about him. Is there anything harsher you want to say about him now?
No, except I was very disappointed in him. I thought there would be sufficient integrity that he would come into my office and say, I'm resigning from the NDP. I didn't expect to be ambushed in the legislature on the critical budget vote as I was.
He snuck up on you, right? I mean,
so he snuck up.
He didn't tell you ahead of time he was going to do it.
And nobody realized on our side that this was going to happen.
They knew on the other side.
There is debate, clear debate on the other side. In fact, it can be demonstrated. They were aware, they were conscious of what was going to happen.
Let's just finish up now to talk about life after politics, because there is life after politics. You're back in the province of Ontario. You've been teaching at the University of Windsor. You were actually a union leader for a while of the professors at the University of Windsor. What are you doing now?
Well, right now I'm doing still a little teaching. Besides finishing this book, I'm involved in a lot of different organizations, a long list of them. But I also do some teaching. Last year I taught a course at the University of Windsor. I may very well, within the next year, be teaching another course. Steve, I found a life after politics. I know you've dealt with this in some of your writing. I was very fortunate. I came here for 1 year to teach, and I found I enjoyed it so much. And the University of Windsor was so good to me. They tenured me, even though I explained to them I don't have a PhD. I have a law degree, but not a PhD. Oh, Howard, we consider your experience to be equivalent to a PhD.
I would think so.
So they have been very, very good to me. And there's nothing I like better than teaching students. Some people are addicted to drugs and alcohol. With me, I'm addicted to teaching young people.
That's wonderful. Keep True, A Life in Politics is the name of Howard Pawley's autobiography, and we're so glad you came in to tell us about it tonight here at TVO.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's been a pleasure.